Director William Eubank gives us Paranormal Activity Next of Kin, which is the 7th official movie in the Paranormal Activity franchise. Apparently there's actually an 8th movie, but that's an unofficial one, so it doesn't count. Now, you often hear that movies will give you messages, and there's sometimes a movie might be a metaphor or a kind of have hidden kind of meanings in there. I can't help but this movie is kind of a almost like an allegory for America going up and fucking up other cultures, because that's kind of the message I was getting from this movie. Now, I have to say that I have never seen any of the Paranormal Activity movies up until now. I'm obviously aware of them, but I've never seen a single one. So I'm going to be looking at this as a purely, a insular movie really, and not really judging it against any of the previous kind of entries, which may or may not be a good thing depending on obviously your kind of opinions. But like I've said, I'm not going to be judging it as how it compares to the part of the series, rather than just how it compares on its own as a film, critically. So what's the story? I feel this movie doesn't really have anything to do with the previous movies. It focuses on this kind of woman who finds out that she actually, she was adopted ultimately, and finds out that she is related to this kind of like small group of Amish people out in the kind of the country. And she kind of meets one of these guys with her kind of boyfriend and this other guy to kind of do like a kind of documentary about her kind of roots and things. So she goes to this kind of small community, and it's all, very kind of different to what they're expected. You kind of get some fish out of water kind of situations, these kind of modern city folk, so to speak, dealing with this kind of rural Amish kind of style kind of community and how they get on. And she's kind of wondering, her mother has seemed to have given her up when she was a kid, and she's wondering kind of why that is. Now, there may be supernatural shenanigans going on. If you're aware of the title of this movie, you'll know that's absolutely the case. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie to find out. So, this is a found footage style movie, as is the whole of the Paranormal Activity series, as far as I'm aware. Let's talk about what I think works in this film. So, despite this being a found footage movie, it has a real sheen to it, a real kind of like high production value compared to, just other found footage movies. Again, I haven't seen the original paranormal movies since this one, so I can't compare it against them. But to me, the kind of this kind of like professional sheen was plain to see, and I'm gonna come back to that. But it makes it so sometimes you even forget this is a found footage movie. Some of the sequences, particularly towards the end, kind of a more traditional kind of found footage. But for the first kind of 2 acts of the movie, there's sequences here, including establishing shots, things like that, that kind of make it feel, I think, probably more cinematic than the majority of found footage movies and things like this. It's a good and a bad thing, and for the reasons it's good is obviously it makes it there's sequences that work that are more cinematic because of it. Obviously, found footage has its placing kind of in cinema, but there are shortcomings because of the kind of the way it's filmed, and ultimately you get lots of kind of shaky cam and things like this, and kind of grainy, unprofessional footage. This one has this really kind of like glossy, professional feel to it, so it's easier to follow. And those of you who may not like found footage movies, I think this is more of a digestible film, because a lot of the kind of the sequences don't really feel like found footage. I have to say, I thought the acting was all pretty good. We have our 3 kind of central characters, and I all thought they did their roles pretty well. We have kind of like the comic relief guy, kind of our main protagonist, and kind of her boyfriend. And despite the fact we don't really see the boyfriend a hell of a lot, because he's the one that tends to be behind the camera, I think you will get a good sense of who these people are, and obviously these kind of the other characters who play this kind of Amish kind of style family. I thought the acting does a kind of a pretty good job. The movie also has some scale to it. Again, found footage movies tend to be on the lower budget side, and under the Paranormal Activity movies have become quite the phenomena, and as such this film feels like it has a little bit more production value than other kind of maybe found footage films, particularly kind of in the final act we see kind of all sorts of kind of things going on at a much kind of larger scale than I think you do see in a lot of these kind of found footage movies, with a kind of a lot of like set decoration, location shooting, lots of kind of cast members, and kind of lots going on, particularly kind of in the last kind of 10 minutes of the movie. I have to say, I thought the ending of this movie was pretty good. And it's not one of these films that you don't really see anything. They feel that they do a good job here. Certainly, again, that last kind of 10 minutes of the film, I think you do get a reasonable kind of look about what's kind of going on. And it kind of, I think it looks pretty good. The special effects, for the most part, I think are pretty good. There's a couple of kind of like composite shots that don't work quite so well, but for the most part, I think the effects work here does a good job. The movie does have some creepy moments, and there is a few jump scares here and there. That obviously a staple of kind of found footage films, really. But I think they're not as much as maybe some of these kind of found footage films do have. And they do a good mix of kind of creepiness, atmosphere building, jump scares, kind of even some kind of like violent scenes kind of towards kind of the ending there. So I think it has a reasonable mix of in its armoury of kind of scare factor here. Okay, so what doesn't work? This to me falls into some of the typical traps that found footage movies do. So both in a thematic level and what I would say at kind of a technical level. So on a technical level, let me just start that first of all. Now, as I've mentioned, I feel one of the key things about this film is it's kind of like it's somewhat high production value compared to regular found footage movies, and it's great because it makes it kind of look cinematic. But there's also elements here that don't really make sense on a kind of a technical level. For example, just to kind of demonstrate one scene, we have a kind of a dinner scene in the kind of probably the beginning of the second act of the movie, and this is kind of where we have our three kind of outsiders ultimately having dinner with this family, and they're all kind of singing this song, kind of banging their like fists on the table, and then we have like these quick cuts of different camera angles, but it's all kind of the audio is kind of going at the same pace. So the only way that you would be able to do that is if you were to have multiple cameras, but we don't. We only have one camera, so it doesn't make sense that the kind of like, you're having like these edits with different kind of shots, but the kind of the audio being kind of like one thing, if that makes sense, because it kind of looks like it's filmed with multiple cameras, which it probably was, but obviously for the context of one person filming, it doesn't really kind of make sense. So there's some elements here that are cinematic and look kind of more of your traditional kind of style, movies and camera work, and that's just one example. There are a few times in movies that stuff are like this, including kind of sound effects and music swells and things like this. When we have kind of scary moments, a found footage movie really shouldn't have a kind of a soundtrack, so to speak. We still get that. So there's things here that kind of like, I think, take away from the kind of the found footage feel and make it feel like it should be a more of a traditionally film style movie. So I think this movie wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to be a found footage movie because ultimately that's kind of what the Paranormal Activities are, but it still wants to have the sensibilities of a more of a traditionally kind of styled movie, which kind of makes it this weird hybrid. And part of the kind of the charm of found footage movies is that kind of that immersion that you're kind of watching this found footage. But because this movie has some elements which is somewhat overproduced, it kind of loses that ultimately. Yeah, it's more glossy, but it kind of loses that kind of that sense of realism being a kind of a found footage movie. I actually think this could have not been a found footage film, and it probably would have been maybe more effective, but maybe out of brand for the Paranormal Activity. So that's what it is on a kind of a technical level. But there's also story elements here that kind of, again, just don't make really a lot of sense. For example, our first real kind of sign of this paranormal kind of activity, so to speak, is we have this our main protagonist sneak into this kind of room, which was apparently her mother's, and we see there's some kind of presence there, and she's in kind of like she ultimately is hiding under the bed, and there's another problem I have this. Again, I'm just going to use this one scene to kind of demonstrate some of the issues I have with it on a thematic level. So she's hiding under the bed because she's sneaking around because she can hear stuff above her, you know, in the floor upstairs. Now, why is she sneaking around and her grandfather comes in and is like, who's in there and all that sort of stuff? And why is she hiding? I mean, what's he going to do? There's no real sense of, I mean, why doesn't she just confront him? There's no real reason for her to hide. And he kind of goes out the room, and then she believes she's on his own, but then we see there's something sitting on the bed because the bed depresses, and it has that typical thing where it's got like a void. So you know something's going to happen on camera because it has this kind of void here. And then, of course, you see the bed depress. Then she kind of gets out and then sees a reflection in the mirror and she's all scared. And then the next day she's telling her boyfriend, oh yeah, I saw this reflection in the mirror. But she doesn't mention the fact that someone was kind of sitting on the bed and there was no one there. Again, it's that typical thing where we have horror films where something clearly kind of has happened, but no one questions it. So again, it kind of has that kind of sillier elements. And just things like I've said, I think there's no, you know, this kind of like this trio of people are going into this kind of house and they're kind of just like helping themselves, filming everyone, and kind of like sneaking about. And I think you know, there's a point in the film where they don't know, for the majority of the film, they're not normally not sure anything is amiss really. And it's like, why would you be kind of sneaking around? Because at this point you don't really kind of know anything's kind of supernatural going on. So why would you be kind of sneaking around? So there's some thematic problems with this as well that I just thought it ends up kind of being typical kind of like movie logic. So I think this movie has an interesting plot in a way, but it falls down because it ultimately becomes very typical. You know, very kind of typical kind of movie logic. And I've just given you a couple of examples. I don't want to kind of go through every single one because I don't want to spoil the film. But I've just given you some examples of how it doesn't work on a technical level and how it doesn't work on a thematic level. Outside of that, I feel it, I mean, again, I haven't seen the Paranormal Activity movies, but the story follows somewhat of a kind of a typical trajectory in regards to kind of plot. I haven't seen the found footage movies that are to do with the Paranormal Activity films, but I've seen plenty of found footage horror movies. They a lot of them follow you know, the basics of a kind of a tried and tested plot. And like I've said, it says to me that the message of this film is that Americans come in, you know, throwing their weight around, judging what they feel is right, and kind of messing up this kind of like other culture, and because they want to do things their way. That was the message I got from this film. Whether that was intentional or not, I assume it probably isn't. That's kind of the message I got left feeling about it. So overall, it's an entertaining film, but it's not one that I think you can really buy into that much. It just doesn't kind of have that immersion factor that I feel a lot of really good found footage movies have. I think it's entertaining, but it kind of ends up being somewhat of a kind of a B movie, despite the fact that it has probably a lot higher production value than a lot of found footage movies, because of its kind of like maybe over-reliance on silliness and kind of unrealistic kind of situations and things like that. It feels a lot more B-movie than it probably is. And there's B-movies that I think do a lot better job in having that kind of a lot more of a sense of kind of urgency, because it kind of, you know, draws you in with that kind of sense of immersion. So it's an entertaining watch, but I don't think it's particularly kind of fantastic. But though I will give it a 6 out of 10, a slightly above average mark, because I do feel it ends pretty strong. And the story is intriguing, and I like the characters and the actors. It's just let down by some silly kind of cheesy, typical kind of like tropes and cliches. Really kind of turned up quite a lot on this one. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.